I know you've all had a long day, but I'll try and keep my more formal remarks a little brief so that we can actually have a discussion. I do want very much to thank the organizers of ABP's Networks Ideas of India 2025. I think it's been a fascinating conference already so far, and the topic they've given me is both timely and significant. The Great Indian Migration is what they've called it. What now in a world of walls? I do want to extend, as I said, my gratitude to the ABP Network for creating this platform and discussing ideas that will shape our country in the future. And I must say, migration is not merely a policy issue. It is a human story woven into our history and our collective aspirations. So to understand Indian migration today, we've got to look back at its origins. Migration has been driven by historical forces, economic imperatives, sheer survival, sometimes even force. Under British rule, more than 2 million Indians were sent abroad as indentured laborers between 1834 and 1917. They built Singapore, they created so many foreign countries, and their descendants are now citizens of those countries. They endured brutal conditions, yet their resilience has shaped the cultural fabric of their adopted lands, from Mauritius to Trinidad and of course, Guyana. And over time, migration evolved. Labor, traders, professionals, entrepreneurs started moving, seeking opportunities worldwide. The 20th century saw waves of Indian migration to the UK, to North America, Africa, and the Gulf, and this culminated in the tech-driven exodus of the 1990s, when Indian professionals became sought-after global talent. Today, Indians are no longer just workers abroad. They are leaders, shaping global industries. From Sundar Pichai at Google to Satya Nadella at Microsoft, we've seen Indian migrants driving innovation and enjoying economic power, heading a significant number of Fortune 500 companies. History has proven to us that migration has always been a force multiplier, enriching both migrants and host nations. Yes, in an era of rising walls, both physical and political, migration faces unprecedented scrutiny. The question is not whether migration should happen, but whether nations will recognize the boundless potential it offers. I began my UN career an awfully long time ago with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I remember we used to issue a poster with a very familiar photograph on that poster saying, "A bundle of belongings is not the only thing a refugee brings to his new country," and below the photo were the words simply, "Einstein was a refugee." And we were trying to encourage people to think of refugees as an opportunity, as a source of talent. Now, for decades, the lure of the American dream, and for many in India, the Canadian alternative, has beckoned young Indians with the prospect of economic opportunity, social mobility, and the chance to build a better future. Most who leave are not revolutionaries or fugitives, as they were in many cases in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, but they're pragmatic individuals seeking a fair shot at prosperity. It's a vast expanse of opportunity in major US cities, the promise of work, the prospect of anonymity just disappearing into the woodwork until one day an amnesty might come. This is what draws them in, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives, and often initially in terrible conditions, but later to acquire the dignity they felt they were lacking back at home. The global economy thrives on their skills, whether it's our IT engineers in Silicon Valley or our cab drivers navigating the streets of Toronto. Migration is not driven by ambition alone. Some, particularly from Punjab, seek asylum, citing persecution, claims dismissed by Indian officials as opportunistic fabrications. Still, we have to ask, why are these claims made at all? A confident democracy should confront, not dismiss, the disillusionment that fuels them. We celebrate tech billionaires while youth unemployment soars, showcase gleaming infrastructure while millions struggle for dignified work. India's growth story remains a paradox. Booming statistics, shrinking opportunities, and a rising power still unable to assure its own people that their future lies at home. Gujarat is a state that's been championed as an economic success story, the very launchpad of our Prime Minister's rise, and yet it sees thousands risking everything to leave. If prosperity were truly abundant, would so many seek an uncertain future abroad? Punjab also presents a stark paradox. Revered as India's breadbasket, it feeds the nation, yet its youth are leaving in droves. The lure of foreign shores is not merely about ambition, it's often about survival. Rising unemployment, dwindling agricultural reforms, and modest returns, and an insidious drug crisis in Punjab have eroded hope, leaving many with little choice but to seek their fortunes abroad, legally or otherwise. When people from India's most prosperous states are amongst the most desperate to leave, then the issue isn't just migration, it's the conditions that make escape for them a necessity rather than a choice. In their despair, many turn to shadowy networks, paying staggering sums to be smuggled across borders, not out of recklessness, but because they see no future in the land they once called home. The consequences are stark. What was once the path of young single men now sees entire middle-class families, once the bedrock of India's ambitions, risking everything for a fresh start abroad. I don't know how many of you remember the story a couple of years ago of the middle-class family from Gujarat that froze to death on the Canadian-American border during the peak of winter trying to cross over from Canada illegally to America. There were photos of their home in Gujarat, a perfectly reasonable, upper-middle-class looking residence. Why did they leave? These are questions we owe it to ourselves as a nation to ask ourselves. For many who leave, the struggle doesn't end when they cross the border. It follows them, sometimes in the most tragic ways. We hear of migrants working endless hours in exploitative conditions, of families back home waiting for news that never comes, and when disaster strikes, even death does not often bring closure. Just recently, reports have surfaced of crowdfunding campaigns raising lakhs, ostensibly to bring back the bodies of deceased NRIs, yet in far too many cases that money never reaches their grieving families. Just imagine that. A system where people leave because they feel they have no choice, and even in death they remain abandoned. Migration should not come at the cost of dignity in life or in death. If India is to truly rise, it must become a nation where people do not feel compelled to leave, but feel empowered to stay. The question is not just why they leave, but what they find when they get there. The American dream, once seen as a golden ticket, is increasingly a mirage. Many find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of uncertainty, living in fear of deportation, working jobs that barely sustain them, struggling to integrate into societies that at times view them with suspicion. Immigration has long been an integral part of human history, shaping civilizations, economies, societies across the globe. India, with its rich tradition of global engagement, has seen our people traverse continents in pursuit of opportunity, knowledge, and a better future. And as I said, every year millions are embarking on this journey, making India today the country with the highest number of migrants in the world. But with each movement also comes the challenge of irregular migration, an issue that's drawn increasing attention these days, particularly with the US. Now let me be unequivocal, every sovereign nation has the right to enforce its immigration laws and uphold the integrity of its borders. The US, in its recent actions, is well within its legal authority to return those who've entered their territory unlawfully. However, the manner in which this process is conducted is equally important. Deportation, when necessary, must be carried out with dignity and respect for human rights. The recent images of shackled and handcuffed migrants being loaded onto military aircraft, reminiscent more of a criminal extradition than an immigration enforcement measure, have understandably sparked widespread concern in our country. And let's be clear, it's not an isolated incident, nor, by the way, is deportation just being conducted because Mr. Trump won the election. The deportation of migrants from the United States has been an ongoing reality spanning multiple presidencies. Under the Biden administration alone, 1,100 Indians were deported in the last fiscal year. Since October 2020, Nearly 170,000 Indian migrants have been detained by US Customs and Border Protection while attempting to cross the borders illegally, either from Canada or from Mexico. They're all subject to deportation. But to truly understand what's fueling this wave of irregular migration, we have to look beyond the headlines. Some argue that these rising asylum claims reflect shrinking freedoms at home, but I don't think that's really a good enough explanation. The reality is more complex. Migration, especially from Punjab and Gujarat, has been deeply ingrained in our history, and it's partially driven not just by need, but by aspiration. If you can afford to pay agents 50 lakhs or even 1 crore, as in 1 or 2 cases that have been reported, to smuggle you into America or Canada, then obviously it's not economic need. You could live very well for a very long time on that kind of money in India. With remittances hitting 120 billion in 2023, 120 billion US dollars, migration fuels a cycle where families often seek to replicate the success of their relatives abroad. This has birthed a thriving network of agents, promising Western shores often through questionable means. So that we can't afford to treat this as somebody else's problem. With nearly 1 in 4 Indian immigrants in the US undocumented, and an estimated total of 725,000, 7.25 lakh as of 2 years ago, undocumented Indians in the US, the message is clear that it's not an issue we can afford to overlook in our own national credibility. Recent events reveal stark contrasts with how the US has been handling deportations. When the US sought to deport Colombian nationals on a military aircraft, Colombia refused and said, we'll send you our own plane to repatriate our citizens. Mexico, too, reasserted its sovereignty with President Claudia Sheinbaum emphasizing that while the US can enforce its laws, other nations have the right to determine how their citizens are returned. India must uphold the same principle. Those facing deportation are not criminals in this country, but they're individuals caught in immigration technicalities, no visa or expired visa, undocumented entries, bureaucratic missteps, and frankly, simply being cheated by unscrupulous agents. And yet they're often treated as felons, subject to shackles, handcuffs, military transport. And that is an insult to their human struggles. Deportation is an administrative process. It need not be a punitive spectacle. Humiliating individuals to deter others serves no just purpose. It merely erodes their dignity and distorts justice. And we must ask, does a democracy treat another democracy's citizens in this way? Does border enforcement justify eroding human dignity? And if deportation is necessary, must it undermine the very values that the deporting nation is supposed to uphold? Diplomacy is not just policy, it's a reflection of national character. While India does not and should not endorse illegal immigration, we should not be silent spectators to the treatment of our citizens abroad. Just as we expect foreigners in India to respect our laws, we demand that Indians too should respect the laws of other countries. But compliance or failure to comply should not result in dehumanization. A nation's stature is not just economic clout or diplomatic reach, but the respect its passport commands. True global engagement isn't just about alliances and trade deals. It's about setting an unwavering standard. Wherever an Indian stands, the nation should stand with him or her. Because when all is said and done, a nation's stature is not measured by the walls it builds to keep people out or in, but by the bridges it maintains with those it sends away. And so in the so-called world of walls, to use the title ABP gave me, where borders are fortified, visas are weaponized, and entire lives are upended by the stroke of an immigration officer's pen, the real question is not why Indians are being sent back, but why they had to leave in the first place. Why has the pursuit of dignity, stability, and economic security led millions of our countrymen and women to distant shores only to be met with closed doors? Why is India one of the world's fastest growing economies, as we've just heard, a rising geopolitical force, and a nation with unparalleled human capital? Why are we still unable to provide enough opportunities to to our own people? These are uncomfortable questions, but ones we can no longer ignore. For decades, the great Indian migration has been driven by the search for a better life, some for education, others for jobs, but many out of necessity. As deportations rise, the conversation must go beyond their removal to the conditions that push them away. Indians and India must not be a place migrants are forced to return to unwillingly, but one they want never to leave or to come back happily when they do. Those coming back are potentially skilled, ambitious individuals whose experiences and energies can drive India's growth. To break the cycle we've seen so far, we need real structural change, not just rhetoric. Opportunities must be accessible to all, not concentrated amongst the privileged. Cities must fuel inclusive growth. Rural economies must become hubs of innovation. And investment in infrastructure, education, and entrepreneurship must be national imperatives. More than just jobs, India must offer careers that inspire people to stay, build, and invest in their future here. This is a collective responsibility for all Indians. Every institution, policymaker, corporate leader, entrepreneur, and citizen who envisages a stronger India must play a part. Political parties must think beyond the next election and commit to long-term nation building. Policy must move from quick fixes to systemic reform. The economy must not only generate jobs, but ensure they're worth aspiring to. A young graduate in Delhi or Patna should feel as confident about their future in India as they would in Toronto or London. As the world builds walls, India must build bridges. Bridges to opportunity, to prosperity, and to a future where migration is a choice, not a necessity. A great nation is not measured by those who leave, but by those who stay because they believe. They believe in what lies ahead. India must not just be the world's largest exporter of talent, but one day a magnet for talent. A place where ambition flourishes without an outbound ticket. Where success is celebrated here at home. Where prosperity is not an aspiration or a dream, but a reality shaped on our own soil. Let us make India once again a land of hope. Not just because the world is rejecting our people, but because if done right, they will have no need to look elsewhere. Thank you. I'm going to leave it there for now. Jai Hind, and I look forward to the discussion to follow.
So, Dr. Tharoor, your address has greatly enriched our understanding of the Indian migration. You've put everything in perspective very effectively for us, so thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please start this Q&A session with a round of applause for one of the most eloquent, well-spoken, and a politician who really doesn't hesitate from speaking his mind. The recent things that have happened, I'm going to ask a question on that. But sir, you touched upon on the issue of illegal migration, and so I want to start this Q&A with that. Just the other day, so a video tweeted out by White House. The video was focused on those handcuffs and the chains with which they were tying the legs of those illegal immigrants. They don't even call them immigrants, they call them illegal aliens. And then that video was, quote, retweeted by Elon Musk with a comment, wow. So my question to you, Dr. Tharoor, you've been in the space of international diplomacy for a very long time. Sending those people back who are illegal immigrants is understandable. But to be sending them back in a manner which is so demeaning to the human spirit, is that an accepted thing?
No, it's not acceptable. And as I said, both Colombia and Mexico refused to accept it. They said that they would not allow their citizens to be treated that way, and I believe we should take the same stand. I don't know whether the Prime Minister did so behind closed doors when he was in Washington, but the fact that a couple more flights have continued with the men still handcuffed and shackled, at least after the first flight, the women were no longer treated this way, but still it really was pretty shameful. And this dehumanization is really not necessary. Once they've left American soil, why do they need to do this? To my mind, this is a completely unnecessary development on the part of those who really ought to know better. If America values its relationship with India, then they've made their political point to their domestic Megha audience by issuing this video. They should cease and desist forthwith. And what is more, we should insist on that. There's now an interesting development. They started sending these planes to Panama and Costa Rica instead of sending them directly to India.
Yeah.
And therefore there might be some intermediate process when their deportation is screened through there, and then maybe it'll happen thereafter in commercial aircrafts or chartered aircraft rather than military ones, and maybe it will no longer involve all of this. But I think we should insist on bringing that about, because to my mind this is an insult to us as a nation as well. It's not just the dehumanizing of our citizens as an insult to us as a nation. We shouldn't take it, and we should tell them this is not the act of a friendly country. We don't condone what they've done. They shouldn't have gone illegally, but nonetheless, send them back with decency, with some dignity. They're our people.
Dr. Tharoor, the BJP turns around and says that we've actually been taking this far too long. And in 2011, and I was reading some articles, in 2011, the government of Dr. Manmohan Singh was cornered exactly on this issue because there were Indian students who had radio collars around their ankles, and that's how America decided on tracking or keeping a track on them. And, you know, Dr. Manmohan Singh had to defend all of that. The accusation was this is the love that Dr. Manmohan Singh has shown for Bush and for America, and look at how they are treating our students. So this has been going on for a long time.
The radio collars were slightly less dehumanizing than shackles and handcuffs, which is much worse. I'll tell you why, because I mean, this is a standard practice in America when, for example, a convict has parole and is essentially able to be at home. They just want to make sure the radio collar means that they don't escape the jurisdiction of the cops. That's all this is. But I'm not excusing any of this. I just feel that right now, they've done something wrong. Send them back, no problem. Send them back as soon as you catch them. We don't mind, as long as their identity is confirmed. They really are our citizens. But don't treat them in this dehumanizing way. If you must handcuff them until you put them on a plane, even that is happening on your soil because you want to make sure they don't escape in your country. Maybe we can accept that. But once they're on the plane, take the blessed handcuffs off and let them come as regular passengers. This is silly and insulting.
Dr. Tharoor, what really intrigues me, and I guess what the moot question here is what has changed in the last few years that you were quoting a number, you know, in your address. You said in 2018, the number of people who were illegally moving from India to US was somewhere around 8,000. The numbers increased to 96,000 in 2022-23. What has changed?
I think a number of things have happened. Frankly, one of the problems is that our people's aspirations have not been matched by our success stories at home. We talk about economic growth, but it's been largely jobless growth. And young people coming of age and finding they don't have jobs available are the ones who are trying to leave, for the most part. Not everybody, like the middle-class family that froze to death. They were not just young, but by and large, this is number one. Number two, as usual, the sharks have leapt into the waters, and the unscrupulous agents have decided this is a great opportunity to make money. The ones who went earlier and who remained, for the most part, those who went legally, of course, were success stories in places like Silicon Valley. Those who went illegally were amnestied. There have been 3 or 4 waves of amnesty in the US in the last 25, 30 years. And then these people are succeeding and sending money back, and when they visit, they're visiting sort of clad in the latest designer outfits and having lots of money, dollars to spare. That suddenly has sent some gleams up in people's eyes. So there's a self-reinforcing element that the success of earlier migrants encourages newer migrants. And thirdly, there is undoubtedly, I think, a genuine problem in some specific states where there just aren't enough opportunities. In Punjab, the young people are essentially expected to make a living on farms that can't sustain them. And so for them, essentially, they are saying, let's go. I mean, some are staying behind and doing drugs, which is much worse in some ways than trying to risk migration. But if they have any money, or they can sell their land, which is not giving them enough of an income, and make money, they're spending it getting their passage to Panama or Mexico or Canada and then trying to come in. So all of these factors have happened. I did a piece about this a couple of, well, more than a couple of months ago, late last year, for an international syndicate, and I had all the figures at that time. 725,000 is a Pew Research Center estimate of just 2020, so it's gone up since then.
Right.
The UN Population Fund has an estimate which is much higher than the official estimate of the government of India for the number of people leaving India. I think we've claimed a figure like about 900,000 leaving every year. The numbers are much higher.
Okay.
And the problem, therefore, is that if the rest of the world thinks there are more Indians leaving, legally, illegally, and everything else, we do have to ask ourselves, as a country, what we can do to set that right. Not by restricting immigration. In any case, people will never tell you the truth. What they'll do is they'll say they're going on a student visa, or they'll say they're going on a tourist visa to a particular neighboring country. How many Indians really want to be tourists in Panama or Mexico? But they go. Yeah. And then they quietly pay for the so-called donkey route and go in really hazardous conditions into America.
Yeah. But Dr. Sab, staying with the issue of migration, one final question on this aspect that I want to take is about the India-Canada equation. You'd agree, Dr. Tharoor, that the equation between the two countries is perhaps at its all-time low at this moment, at least till Prime Minister Trudeau was around. There are a lot of students, lots of Indian students who are finishing their studies in Canada. They all find themselves caught in this conundrum. How does the country, balance its national interest on one side with the interest of the citizens on the other? My question to you, Dr. Tharoor, had you been handling the Ministry of External Affairs, what would you have done differently to not reach a situation like this today between India and Canada?
With Canada, I mean, I'm in regular touch with the Foreign Minister, and I have some sympathy for the very tough line that India has taken. Because, while we respect Canada and we respect their freedom of speech and their traditions, which in some ways are different from ours, and they permit, for example, open advocacy of secession, which we don't in our country. So the Free Quebec movement can freely preach that they should secede from Canada, and they're allowed to do that. We don't allow that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, to condone and permit certain elements on their soil to not just preach but plan and execute murder and mayhem in India is unforgivable. And it goes right back to the Khalistani bombing of the Air India Kanishk aircraft in 1985. To this day, nobody has been punished for it. The Canadians ran such a botched inquiry that it's impossible to have any respect for their law enforcement or their judicial process. You can't have people who publicly gloated and celebrated and took credit for the killings of all these innocent Indians and Canadians who are allowed to go scot-free and thrive in that place. So, I mean, the Canadians have been pretty feckless. On top of that, we've unfortunately seen a situation where, yes, this particular government and Prime Minister has had some dependence on elements that are openly sympathizers of Khalistan extremism. And I say extremism because we have to accept that it is not illegal to preach secession in Canada. But it is certainly illegal to plan and execute and order murder. And they've been doing that. And that's something which we simply can't allow. We've been trying, for example, to extradite a dozen people from there. We're not able to bring them. And there is a lot of political pandering to the worst elements in Canada. So, for example, anybody who served in the Indian Army or the police and applies for even a tourist visa to Canada is denied on the grounds that if you're in the Indian Army or police, you're guilty of human rights abuses. What nonsense is this? I mean, these are insulting stands for a government to take, and I don't blame our government for saying we're not going to accept that. Equally, I think that on the people-to-people level, the relations are excellent. Trade with Canada, I think, is as high as 50 billion. It's going very well. There's no particular problem there. It is only, unfortunately, now at the government-to-government, and particularly over the issue specifically of the Khalistan terrorist attacks that have been based on their soil and that have been conducted, sadly, with some complicity on the part of lax law enforcement. And this is the way most Indians see it, and they do believe it's wrong. But we have not prevented our students from going there. And if students find that it's, for example, cheaper to study in Canada than in North America, but it gives them all the advantages of a North American degree, and gives them even the opportunity to work in both countries. That's right. Very often people with a Canadian degree and Canadian status are allowed to work in America. All of that makes Canada very attractive to them. The challenge for us now is we don't want to stand in the way of our kids' aspirations, but we certainly want to ensure that those aspirations do not justify mistreatment by the government of our national interests. So we have to stand up for our national interests too.
So we are hoping with the leadership change, maybe the things get better between the two countries. Now, we've spoken adequately about the issue of migration, Dr. Tharoor. Let me take a few political questions with your permission now. First of all, Dr. Tharoor, tell me, after a fairly encouraging performance in 2024 general elections, the Congress party seems to have hit a slippery slope that's consistently taking the party down. Whether it was Haryana, whether it's Maharashtra, now Delhi. What worked for you in 2024 May and June, which is not working for you anymore, Dr. Tharoor?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that in India, frankly, we have not just one nation, but we also have 28 states and a few union territories, and each have their own political histories, their own political character, and their own political realities. And therefore, what works in a national election often is a message that gets transmuted very differently at the state level. And the Indian voters, by and large, have become sophisticated enough to choose differently when it comes to nation and state. Secondly, as you know, there have been some concerns expressed that the media hasn't been entirely fair. I mean, I think Sachin Pilot today was pointing out that, well, a lot of attention was paid to the seats lost in Rajasthan. There were 11 seats the Congress won at the expense of the BJP, and those were not mentioned by the media, and so on and so forth. So you're really looking at a situation where the story is not as simple, not as black and white as your question portrayed it.
Okay.
I think, obviously, every party believes it can bounce back, and I think as long as Congress learns the right lessons from these experiences and takes the right steps, we still have a positive
Dr.
future.
Tharoor, put your hand on your heart and tell me, do you think the current leadership in Congress, which is Mr. Rahul Gandhi and partly Priyanka Vadra, will ever be able to put the party back in power?
Look,
And I'm so sorry to interrupt, sir, but if this could be a brief answer, because we are out of time, and again, I extend my apologies, but we are out of time. So a quick comment.
I'm
please.
not the one
That's my
asking
last
the
question, Radhika. That's my
Thank
last
you.
question, but
so,
yeah.
So then my answer would be we are out of time, Megha. We'll talk about this some other. No, I mean, obviously we believe we'll do fine. The right circumstances in the right states at the right time, and there is, you know, the good thing about India is there's an election every 6 months somewhere or the other. Give us a chance to prove ourselves. Thank
All
you
right.
very much.